Hi guys, today we're going to be talking about chapter 3, which is entitled Digestion Meals from Meals to Molecules. I'm sure that just about all of you have covered the digestive system in a biology class or at another point in your education, but today we're going to dive a little bit deeper into each of the individual parts of the digestive system and how they play a role in nutrition. The organization of life. Levels of organization. So first, all the way on the left is the smallest unit of matter, atoms. Atoms are linked by chemical bonds to form molecules. So number 2, second from the left, we have molecules. Molecules form the structures that make up cells. Each cell is bounded by a membrane. In multicellular organisms, cells are usually specialized to perform specific functions. So when several molecules get together, they form cells. When those cells get together, they form what are known as tissues. And so tissues are groups of similar cells, such as muscle, shown in the example. When tissues get together, they make what's known as organs. Organs such as the stomach are structures that perform specific functions in the body. Multiple organs together make up an organ system. An organ system is a group of organs that work together to perform a particular function to form an entire organ system. And then multiple organ systems work together to ensure proper functioning of the entire organism, which is us. Table 3.1 in your text gives examples of each of the organ systems in our body. I'm just going to go through and name them really quick. We have the nervous system, the respiratory system, the urinary system, reproductive system, cardiovascular and circulatory system, lymphatic and immune system, muscular system, skeletal system, endocrine system, integumentary system, and finally the digestive system. So this is where we're going to be spending all of our time today. The digestive system. The digestive system is responsible for both digestion and absorption of nutrients. Now, we define digestion as the process by which food is broken down into absorbable units. And digestion technically means to take apart. When we say absorbable units, what we're talking about are simple sugars, which are the building blocks of carbohydrates, amino acids, which are the building blocks of protein, and fatty acids, which are the building blocks of lipids. The digestive system is also called the gastrointestinal or GI tract or digestive tract. It's a hollow tube about 30 feet long that runs from your mouth to your anus. So when we're saying a hollow tube, we're talking about the whole system. So the entire trip that food takes from the time it enters your mouth to the time you excrete it out in waste, through your stomach, through your small intestine, your large intestine, all of that is essentially one big long tube that's about 30 feet in length, which is kind of crazy to think about it all wrapped up inside of you, but it is 30 feet long. So different parts of the GI tract. So along that 30-foot tube, there's different layers. The first is the lumen, and this is the inside of the GI tract. And you can see it, it's kind of that pinkish area in the center of the picture on the right. Next is the mucosa, and the mucosa is the layer of mucosal cells that line the lumen. You can see it's indicated at the bottom of the picture. You can kind of see it as that ring around the lumen. Mucosal cells only live about 2 to 5 days. New cells are formed continuously to replace those that die. So that's a cycle that's taking place all the time, every day in our digestive tract, and we have no idea. But our body continuously regenerates those cells. The mucosa has high nutrient needs and is one of the first parts of the body to be affected by nutrient deficiencies. So depending on how your diet is, if you're not getting enough of particular nutrients, then those mucosal cells along the lining of the lumen of your digestive tract will be unable to reproduce and regenerate themselves when they're damaged. This could, of course, affect your ability to absorb nutrients in the future. Transit time. You're going to see this word again in this chapter. When we say transit time, what we're referring to is the time it takes food to travel the length of the GI tract. This is from the moment you eat it until you excrete it as waste. Assisting organs. So these are organs that aren't necessarily major players in the digestive system, but they are really important to making sure that the digestive system is able to work properly. So we have the salivary glands. These are located in your mouth and at the top of your throat, and they produce saliva, which contains a starch digesting enzyme called amylase that we'll talk about later. Next is the liver. The liver makes bile, which aids in digestion and absorption of fat. The gallbladder, which stores bile and releases it into the small intestine when needed. And the pancreas, which releases bicarbonate to neutralize intestinal contents and also produces enzymes that digest carbohydrate, protein, and fat. So you can see that all of these assisting organs are really, really important. Certainly food can travel from your mouth through to your rectum, but in order to be broken down properly so that the nutrients can be absorbed, you need to have those enzymes present that come from these assisting organs. So any damage to these assisting organs, your liver, your gallbladder, your pancreas, your salivary glands, any damage to them could negatively affect your body's ability to absorb the nutrients that it needs. So we're going to talk a little bit more about those secretions that we just mentioned in the last slide. Mucus is secreted from mucosal cells lining the digestive tract. It moistens, lubricates, and protects the inside of your digestive system. So these are those mucosal cells that we were just talking about a couple slides ago, the ones that regenerate every 2 to 5 days. And so by moistening, lubricating, and protecting your digestive system, they help food to move along easily and in a timely fashion, and also protects your digestive system from damage. So if for some reason your body was unable to regenerate those cells every 2 to 5 days, you can see that it would certainly impact the efficiency of your digestive system. Enzymes speed up reactions, helping to break down larger molecules into smaller ones in the digestive tract. Hormones are chemicals secreted from cells which travel through the bloodstream to signal cells in another part of the body. This is a diagram showing us a little bit better about how enzymes work. So we're going to start over on the top right. We have a large carbohydrate molecule in this slice of bread. You would eat this slice of bread, and we see the red chain of molecules, or the red chain of cells making up the molecule. And then we have this particular enzyme, this green enzyme, and it has these two little indents in the top, these two sites that fit perfectly with the carbohydrate molecule. So different enzymes are going to be coded for specific molecules. So this enzyme is coded specifically for this carbohydrate molecule. They fit together perfectly. So when you ingest this piece of bread, it goes through your digestive system and interacts with this enzyme that binds to the carbohydrate molecule and works to break it down into smaller pieces. Then these smaller carbohydrate molecules can either be absorbed or further broken down into smaller pieces that your body can use. Once they're broken down, the enzyme has done its job and it's free again to come back to a larger molecule and start the process all over again. Digestion and absorption of nutrients. So digestion of the 6 nutrients. Water, vitamins, and minerals do not need to be digested as they are already in their absorbable form. Sounds pretty good, right? So we just took care of 3 of the 6 nutrients just like that. Water, vitamins, minerals don't need to be digested. They're just absorbed. All right, now we're going to talk about the next 3. Carbohydrates, protein, and lipids need to be broken down because they're too long to be absorbed the way they're found in foods. They require both mechanical digestion. Mechanical digestion is like the act of chewing, right? You're breaking down that food with your teeth. And chemical digestion, which is the use of enzymes and other chemicals to help in the digestive process. Enzymes are proteins found in digestive secretions that act on food substances, causing them to break down into similar compounds. As we talk about enzymes, you'll notice that they all have the same suffix, ase. If you see this suffix on a word, it denotes that it's an enzyme. For example, lipase lipases are enzymes that work to digest fats, and amylases are enzymes that work to digest carbohydrates. The mouth. Digestion begins in the mouth, also known as the oral cavity. It contains your tongue and your teeth. Digestion in the mouth. So in the mouth, we have both kinds of digestion, mechanical and chemical. So in your mouth, mechanical digestion works on all macronutrients. So mechanical digestion, the movement of your teeth to crush and grind larger pieces of food, that's going to work on carbs, fats, and proteins. Also, saliva and beverages help to moisten the food so that you can easily swallow it. Chemical digestion. The salivary glands release saliva that is rich in enzymes, which help to break down the carbohydrates and fats at the chemical level. The starches and large fats are being broken down into smaller pieces. So while the mechanical digestion in your mouth works on carbs, fats, and proteins, the chemical digestion is only for carbohydrates and fats, right? Proteins do not undergo chemical digestion in the mouth. Salivary glands. The salivary glands squirt just enough saliva to moisten each mouthful of food so that it can pass easily down the esophagus. And you have 3 different salivary glands. You can see with the arrows how they indicate each is in a different location. We have the parotid, which is up at the top of your throat, the sublingual, which is under your tongue, and the submandibular, which is right in the back of your mouth underneath your teeth. Saliva. So what's in saliva anyway? Saliva contains water, salts, mucus, and enzymes. Those enzymes are salivary amylase, and again, amylase is what's going to begin the chemical digestion of carbohydrates, and also lingual lipase. And lingual lipase is going to begin chemical digestion of lipids or fats in your mouth. Saliva also protects the teeth and the lining of the mouth, esophagus, and stomach. From the mouth, food begins to move through the pharynx and the epiglottis. When you swallow a mouthful of food, it passes through the pharynx, which is a short tube that's shared by both the digestive and respiratory systems. To bypass the entrance to your lungs, the epiglottis closes off your air passages so that you don't choke when you swallow. When a mouthful of food has been swallowed, it's called a bolus, right? So when you're eating food. Once that food is in your mouth and starts to move into the rest of your digestive system, it's no longer just food. It's food mixed with enzymes, saliva, other chemicals, and at that point, we call it a bolus. Swallowing. So this diagram is showing you how the epiglottis works in your pharynx. So you have the bolus here in your mouth. This is the food mixed with enzymes and other secretions. It's moving over your tongue as you swallow into your pharynx. We have the epiglottis here, which is a little flap. And down this tube is the passageway to your lungs. So you don't want to get food down this passageway into your lungs. And so in order to make sure that the bolus goes where it's supposed to, the epiglottis, this little flap, will automatically fold and close down, allowing the bolus to pass directly into your esophagus when you swallow. Then once you're done swallowing, the epiglottis opens back up again so that you're able to breathe and take air in down into your lungs. If food does enter the airway, it can be removed by coughing or the Heimlich maneuver, which is demonstrated here in these photos. The esophagus. The esophagus connects your pharynx to your stomach. The bolus of food is moved through the esophagus by rhythmic muscle contractions called peristalsis. The esophagus has two sphincters. Sphincters are just sort of tight muscle openings that open and close to allow things to pass through them. So there's an upper esophageal sphincter, and this can tighten or relax to allow food to move into your esophagus. And then there's the lower esophageal sphincter, which tightens and loosens to regulate and allow the bolus to pass from the esophagus into your stomach. So here's a diagram of what that looks like. We have the esophagus, this tube coming down here from the top. Circular muscles are pushing that bolus down. And then we have the sphincter here, this opening, this sort of valve that exists between the esophagus and the stomach. So the bolus is moving down, but it isn't able to get into the stomach here because that sphincter is closed. Then, once it's ready to enter the stomach, the sphincter relaxes and opens, allowing that bolus to pass from the esophagus into the stomach. Then once the bolus has moved into the stomach, the sphincter closes once again. So now we're in the stomach. The stomach has the thickest walls and strongest muscles of the GI. There's 3 different types of muscles in the stomach: longitudinal, circular, and diagonal. So all of these muscles move in different directions, which allows your stomach to really churn and contract and mix foods together. The sphincter at the end of the stomach, so this is connecting your stomach to your intestine, is called the pyloric sphincter. So just like we saw the sphincter at the top of the stomach that opened and closed to allow the bolus to come in, there's also another sphincter at the bottom of the stomach called the pyloric sphincter that opens and closes to allow food to pass into the intestine once it's properly broken down in the stomach. The stomach lining produces what's known as gastric juice, and the gastric juice contains a whole bunch of really important things. First, water. Also, pepsin is activated into a digestive enzyme. And hydrochloric acid, which is used to kill microorganisms, unfold proteins, activating the pepsin into a digestive enzyme and inhibiting amylase. All right, so let's break this down a little bit more. So we have hydrochloric acid, right? It kills microorganisms. We don't need those. It starts to unfold proteins. When we talk about proteins in a later chapter, you'll see that they're kind of a big tangled mess of amino acids. So in order to properly break those tangled messes down, the hydrochloric acid has to work to unfold them. Pepsin is activated, and pepsin is a digestive enzyme that works to digest proteins, all right? And the hydrochloric acid also inhibits amylase. So the amylase, if you remember, is the enzyme that works to digest carbohydrates that's secreted in the saliva in our mouths. Once that food gets to the stomach, hydrochloric acid stops that amylase from further breaking down the carbohydrates. Your stomach also contains a lot of mucus, and the mucus is really important. The mucus is a protective lining, sort of this, what you would think mucus is, kind of slimy, thick, wet, covering the inside of your stomach lining. Well, why does it have to cover the stomach lining? Well, your stomach is an organ. Your organs are made up of proteins, right? They're muscles. And in your stomach, you have pepsin, which works to digest proteins. So you have a container, right? Your stomach, essentially a container made of protein that contains a chemical that breaks down proteins. So without that mucus layer on the inside of your stomach, the protein digesting enzymes inside the stomach would literally eat through the sides of your stomach. So that mucosal layer is so important. And for some people, their stomachs might have difficulty, might not contain enough mucus, and that can really be dangerous and harm the lining of your stomach, lead to things like ulcers and other serious digestive problems. In the stomach, as we said before, it's very muscular, 3 different types of muscles there, and all those muscles really help to churn and mix food. Not a whole lot of absorption takes place in the stomach. It's really mostly responsible for mixing and breaking down foods. There is some absorption there, however. Water, alcohol, aspirin, acetaminophen are all absorbed in your stomach, but not a lot of real nutrients. So when you were eating, what you ingested we call food. As we said, once that food mixes with enzymes in your mouth and moves through your esophagus into your stomach, we then call it a bolus. Once that bolus enters your stomach and mixes with the hydrochloric acid and the other chemicals there, it's now called chyme, right? Chyme leaves the stomach to enter the small intestine through the sphincter. Remember the pyloric sphincter at the base of the stomach? The stomach emptying is regulated by signals from the small intestine and is affected by meal size and composition. So, if working properly, your pyloric sphincter will open and close at very specific times in order to regulate the amount and the speed at which the chyme moves from your stomach into your small intestine. This is really important because you don't want to flood and overload your small intestine with all kinds of stuff it needs to break down. So it's really important that that regular opening and closing happens to regulate the movement of the chyme. So here we're looking at another sort of breakdown of the stomach to show you all those different muscles. So you have the esophagus here, the sphincter at the base of the esophagus, top of the stomach. And here we see the 3 different muscle layers, longitudinal, circular, and diagonal. So we have the longitudinal are going to run up and down the length of the stomach. We have the circular, which run around the stomach. And then we have diagonal, which sort of crisscross across the stomach. So each of these muscles is going to work in a different direction and really make sure that that food is all churned up when it leaves. Then down at the base of the stomach, we have the pyloric sphincter, and this is what's opening and closing to regulate the movement of chyme from the stomach to the small intestine. This enlarged graphic here on the right is showing a detailed version of the lining of your stomach. So the lining of your stomach isn't smooth, all right? It has what's known as gastric pits, right? So these are all kinds of little folds in along the inside of the lining of your stomach. And inside these gastric pits, deep down inside the lining, there are different types of cells, gastric glands. These are all responsible for those secretions that we talked about. So deep in these gastric pits are the sites that work to spit out mucus, hydrochloric acid, and pepsin, right? Then when we go deeper into the lining of the stomach, underneath all those cells and gastric pits, that's where we have the 3 different muscle layers, okay? So, just to review what we've gone over so far, before food enters the stomach, the thought, smell, sight, or taste of food causes the brain to send nerve signals, and the nerve signals are indicated here by dotted lines, that stimulate gastric secretions and increase the rate of stomach churning or motility, thereby preparing the stomach to receive food. Food entering the stomach increases the rate of gastric secretion and motility by stimulating local nerves, sending signals to the brain, and stimulating the secretion of gastrin, a hormone that triggers an increase in the release of gastric juice. Food leaving the stomach and entering the small intestine distends or stretches the intestine. This stretching triggers hormonal and nervous signals. So this arrow here represents hormones, and this dotted line again is the nervous system signal that decrease stomach motility and slow the secretion of gastric juice. This ensures that the amount of chyme entering the small intestine does not exceed the intestine's ability to process it. So, just kind of going over a little bit of what we already discussed, but also really looking at how many of our body systems are interconnected. The digestive system does a lot of work breaking down our food, but it certainly couldn't do all of that work without getting the messages that it needs about what and when to do things from our nervous system and our hormonal system. So now that we've passed through the pyloric sphincter, we're in the small intestine. The small intestine can be divided into 3 distinct segments: the duodenum, the jejunum, and the ileum. The small intestine as a whole is the main site for digestion and absorption. Chyme is moved by peristalsis. You'll remember peristalsis. It's the movement and contraction of muscles that's responsible for pushing the bolus through your esophagus. We see that again here in the small intestine. And the chyme is mixed by rhythmic constrictions called segmentations. You can think about segmentation. Let's see. Segmentation is kind of like if you're eating one of those pop ices, you know, the frozen popsicles that come in the plastic tube, and you've already eaten at the top of the popsicle, and then you kind of have to pinch your fingers along that plastic tube to break up the popsicle and move it further up closer to your mouth. That's just like the segmentation in your small intestine. It kind of pinches itself and pushes the food along, breaking it up into smaller segments. Your small intestine is about 20 feet long, right? So we talked about the whole digestive system as being about 30 feet long. 20 of that 30 feet is just the small intestine. So that really tells you how large of a role it has. The surface area of your small intestine is actually really large, and that's because it's not smooth. It's all folded and wrinkled up, and this is going to increase the absorption of nutrients. It's covered with what look like little finger projections called villi and microvilli, which we'll talk about more in a little bit. Villi and microvilli together are known as the brush border of your small intestine. Any substances that don't get digested or absorbed pass through the small intestine to the large intestine through another sphincter called the ileocecal valve. Okay, so we have another sphincter here, another muscle that works to open and close and regulate the passing of substances between the small and large intestine. It's called the ileocecal valve. So here we kind of see a blown up picture of the small intestine and more detail about what those villi and microvilli look like. So you'll see the photo in the top center. This is taken with an endoscope, a little camera that they put down in your digestive system to see if things are working okay. So this is actually what the inside of a small intestine looks like, and you can see that it is not smooth at all. There's all kinds of wrinkles and folds in there. Now, if we were to really zoom in on those folds and look even closer, what we would see would look like this picture all the way down at the bottom. All right, lots of folds, lots of big waves, and those big fingers that we see there, those are the villi. Now, if we were to look even closer, you'd see that each of these finger projections, each of these villi, contains an artery, a vein, and a lymph vessel that comes all the way up in each of those villi. Okay, now these are important. We'll talk about these more when we talk about each of the macronutrients, but the presence of these blood vessels and lymph vessels in each of these fingers allows for nutrients to be absorbed through the villi, through the surface of these villi, directly into the blood vessels. The blood and the lymph vessels are then able to ship those nutrients off to other parts of the body where they're needed. Now, you'll see this little inset again here. Zooming in even closer on the villi, we have what are known as microvilli. So these are even tinier little fingers, and they almost look like little hairs all along the outer lining of those villi. And so what their job is to really kind of snag and catch those nutrient molecules as they're coming through the small intestine and help to move them into the villi fold so that they can be absorbed into the arteries and the veins. Small intestine secretions. So just like your stomach, your small intestine also has all kinds of chemicals that it secretes to help further break down the chyme. Your pancreas, we talked about your pancreas earlier as an assisting organ in the digestive process. Your pancreas secretes pancreatic juice. This pancreatic juice contains sodium bicarbonate, which neutralizes the chyme. Okay, so why do we have to neutralize it? Well, the chyme is coming from your stomach, all right? And it now, because it was in your stomach, contains hydrochloric acid, which is very acidic and can be harmful to the lining of other organs like the small intestine. So the sodium bicarbonate works to neutralize the hydrochloric acid that's still in the chyme so that it's not as harmful to the lining of your small intestine. Pancreatic juice also contains pancreatic amylase, and this amylase, again, there's that word with the suffix ase, so we know it's an enzyme. Amylase, we know, is for carbohydrates. That pancreatic amylase works to break down polysaccharides into monosaccharides, We'll talk more about saccharides when we talk about carbohydrates, but looking at the prefixes, we can tell polysaccharides are carbohydrate molecules that are made up of multiple sugar units. Okay, so maybe multiple glucose molecules all bonded together. The pancreatic amylase comes in and breaks those bonds into monosaccharides or single sugar units. The pancreas, their pancreatic juice also contains pancreatic protease. There's that ACE again, so we know it's an enzyme. Protease is responsible for breaking polypeptides down into amino acids. So protease breaks down proteins. Polypeptides, we'll talk about more when we talk about proteins, but polypeptides are large protein molecules. So the protease works to take those large protein molecules and break them down into individual amino acids. Last, pancreatic juice contains pancreatic lipase. There's that ACE suffix. We know that it's an enzyme. We've mentioned lipase in an earlier slide. We know that it works on lipids or fats. And so triglycerides, which are larger fat molecules, the lipase works to break down those triglycerides into smaller fatty acid units and glycerol. The brush border of the small intestine, which is those little villi and microvilli fingers, also secretes digestive enzymes that act on all three macronutrients: fat, protein, and carbohydrates. The liver and the gallbladder, we mentioned these as assisting organs. The liver is responsible for making bile, and then the gallbladder stores that bile. So what's bile? Bile is what's known as an emulsifier. Emulsifiers break up fat droplets so lipases can easily access molecules and complete digestion. Without bile to emulsify fat, it can be difficult for the lipases to break down the molecules, thus making it difficult for your body to absorb the fat-soluble nutrients. This is a diagram of small intestine chemical digestion. It is right in your text. I know that the text probably appears really small here in this slide, so I'm not going to go through all of it. It is kind of a complete summary of the last few slides that we talked about and all the digestion that occurs in the small intestine. I know that we talked about a lot. I know there's a lot of different chemicals that work in the small intestine and different routes of absorption through the blood vessel and the lymph vessel. I would encourage you to look closer at this slide or look closer at the diagram in your text to really familiarize yourself with the digestive mechanisms that take place and how they affect each of the macronutrients. Transport across membranes. All right, so now you have a bunch of molecules that are all broken down and you need to absorb them. Well, how are you going to do that? There's several different types of transport that works to bring nutrients across membranes and into your body. The first is diffusion. Diffusion is movement of substances from areas of higher concentration to areas of lower concentration. That is, they move down a concentration gradient. Next is simple diffusion, which is diffusion across membranes. Osmosis, which is specifically the diffusion of water across membranes. Then we have facilitated diffusion, which is diffusion that takes place through a membrane protein. So for facilitated diffusion, a molecule or another substance isn't able to just move across the membrane on its own. It has to have a helper protein come in and guide it through the process of diffusion. Next, we have the process of active transport. active transport is the opposite of diffusion. So diffusion, whether it's simple diffusion, osmosis, or facilitated diffusion, works to move down a concentration gradient, all right? Because something is moving from a high concentration to a low concentration, it's typically very easy for it to move through the active diffusion. However, active transport is movement of substances across membranes against that concentration gradient. So in the example of active transport, the substance is moving from low concentration to high concentration, which is a lot more difficult than moving down the concentration gradient. So because it's more difficult, it requires energy, also known as ATP, and a membrane protein to help move it from an area of low concentration to an area of high concentration. All right, now this comes right from your book. It's just showing us examples of the types of transport that we talked about in the last slide. So the first example, example A, shows simple diffusion, all right? We have this brush border, these little fingers along the lining of the small intestine. We have fatty acids. This top area here represents the inside of the small intestine, right? So these are all molecules. They're looking to get into the lining, into your blood vessels through the lining of your small intestine, and they're trying to figure out how to get there. So the fatty acids move very easily through the villi into the mucosal cell of the small intestine through simple diffusion. Water molecules, again, those water molecules that move with diffusion, we call that osmosis. Then we have facilitated diffusion here with the fructose. Now the fructose is this weird pentagon shape. It isn't really, but for the sake of this diagram, it takes on kind of a weird shape, and that shape is unable to just move through the villi. So this purple object here is representing a helper protein. So the fructose has to move through the helper protein in order to be able to move through the intestinal membrane. Now, in the last example, we have amino acids, and we see here that there are way more amino acids down here already inside the lining than there are outside. So it's getting pretty crowded down in the lining of your small intestine. You can imagine maybe if you've ever been on the subway, you know, the amino acids are like people trying to pack themselves into a subway car during rush hour, right? It's already really packed. They can't just walk on like these fatty acids in simple diffusion. It really is difficult for them. They have to really pack themselves in there, and that's going to take some energy. So for those amino acids trying to pack themselves into an area that's already highly concentrated with amino acids, it's going to take this helper protein here at the surface of the brush border, and also energy, which exists in the form of ATP, in order to really pull those amino acids in and jam them into a space that's already pretty packed. So from the small intestine, we move into the large intestine. Remember, through the ileocecal sphincter, right? Or the ileocecal valve. The large intestine begins there and then ends at the anus, with both internal and external anal sphincters. The large intestine in total is 5 feet long. So remember, the small intestine was 20 feet long, large intestine 5 feet long. The entire digestive system is 30 feet long. So the rest of it, your esophagus, your stomach, represents the other 5 feet. In your large intestine, we see the absorption of water, some vitamins, and minerals. Just like in the small intestine and the esophagus, we still see peristalsis occurring here, though it does occur more slowly in the colon. Water, nutrients, and fecal matter may spend up to 24 hours in the colon before being excreted. The slow movement of food through your colon favors the growth of bacteria called intestinal microflora. Since fibers are not absorbed, intestinal bacteria ferment some fibers, producing water and gas in small fragments of fat that provide energy to the cells of the colon. Your rectum. The rectum is the last 8 inches of the large intestine. The rectum is where feces are stored. And so we started out with food, then it became a bolus. Then once it entered the small intestine, it became chyme. And once that chyme is broken down and nutrients are absorbed, what are we left with? We're left with feces. Feces are specifically undigested, unabsorbed matter, dead cells, and secretions from the GI tract, water, and bacteria. And these are stored here in the rectum before excretion. So what a scientist sees. You might have seen probiotics and prebiotics maybe advertised on TV or in some foods at your local supermarket, but they're different. So probiotics are foods or supplements that contain beneficial bacteria, whereas prebiotics don't actually contain the bacteria. Prebiotics contain a food supply for the beneficial bacteria. So a prebiotic just contains food for the bacteria that are already existing in your colon, in your large intestine. All right, so here's another chart, similar to charts that we've seen in the first 2 chapters. Gives a pretty basic summary of your gastrointestinal tract. Just as a summary of everything that we've talked about so far, I would encourage you to really look this over, make sure that you understand and are familiar with the functions of each of the parts of the digestive system. Maybe grab a spare piece of paper and draw this out on your own, work on filling it in, just to make sure that, that you really understand each section. Digestion in health and disease. The digestive system and disease prevention. So just a couple questions to keep in mind now that we've talked a lot about the digestive system. As you go through the rest of this lecture, just some things to kind of keep in the back of your head. If you knew the digestive tract was essential to your overall health and played a major role in immunity, would you eat differently? And do you think the typical American diet is promoting health and immunity? All right, just some things to kind of think about based on what we know so far about the digestive system and what we're going to talk about, the relationship between your digestive system and certain diseases. The gut acts as a defense against invasion by disease-causing organisms and other contaminants and allows us to obtain nutrients efficiently. So when we say the gut, we're just talking about your GI tract as a whole. Most food contains bacteria and other contaminants, but our GI tract works hard at keeping us free from harmful illnesses. How does it do this? The acids in our stomach, that hydrochloric acid, works to kill harmful bacteria. The mucosa, the lining of your digestive system, contains immune tissue. These immune tissues contain white blood cells, and phagocytes and lymphocytes are types of white blood cells that attack antigens or foreign substances by either engulfing and destroying the antigen, the phagocytes work to engulf and destroy the antigen. The lymphocyte then binds to the antigen and produces antibodies. And this is an example of what the lymphocytes are shown here in green, the phagocytes in pink, and these red discs are just your red blood cells. Gallstones, we talked about your, whoops, I think we just jumped right ahead. Yep, we did. Okay. Food allergy information on food labels. So we talked about food labels in chapter 2 and how we have the nutrition facts, and below the nutrition facts are the ingredients labels, and how these are really important, especially for folks that are looking to avoid certain substances or have food allergies. Some food labels will also include specific allergy warnings. There's a number of really common food allergies like tree nuts, dairy products, eggs. If products contain any of those common allergens, they typically contain a separate allergy warning just to alert people that that product contains those one or more of those substances. Even though our immune system protects us from many invaders, it's also to blame for allergic reactions. So we just talked about phagocytes and lymphocytes and how they work to attack invaders that might come in through our digestive system. Now, they're also responsible for attacking allergens. And not all of us have allergies, and those with allergies don't all have the same allergies. So for some folks, their immune system, their lymphocytes and phagocytes are a little bit more sensitive and might attack other things that are moving through our body that it thinks are harmful. An allergic reaction occurs when the immune system produces antibodies to an allergen. Food allergies occur when the body sees proteins in foods as an antigen. The first time a food is consumed, it does not trigger an allergic reaction, but antibodies are produced. So, the first time you consume a food, say the first time you have peanut butter, you won't have a problem at all. If you have an allergy, if you end up having an allergy to peanuts, you wouldn't see that until the second time that you consume peanut butter. The first time your immune system just kind of takes note and says, oh yeah, there's that peanut butter, we don't like that, and it recognizes the proteins in the peanut butter, and it's like, okay, if we ever see that come through again, we're going to attack it. So it's not till the second time, when your immune system is already familiar with what those proteins looks like, that it attacks those proteins. The antibodies that it created to match the protein bind to it and signal the release of chemicals that cause allergy symptoms. Eliminating a food that you're allergic to from your diet is the only way to avoid future allergic reactions and or death. Celiac disease. Celiac disease is something that we hear a lot about these days in the news, and it is celiac disease, when properly diagnosed, is an allergic reaction. People with celiac disease are allergic to the protein gluten. Gluten is found in grains such as wheat, rye, and barley. This gluten triggers an immune response that damages the villi of the small intestine. When those villi, those little finger projections of the small intestine, are damaged, it can make it difficult for your body to absorb the nutrients that it needs. People who have celiac disease will feel pain, cramping, diarrhea and constipation, bloating, and fatigue when they consume gluten. If somebody truly has celiac disease, total elimination of these products is necessary. So anything that contains gluten needs to be eliminated from the diet. This includes things made from wheat, like bread, pasta, and many desserts. Heartburn and GERD. They occur when acidic stomach contents move from the stomach into the esophagus through the lower esophageal sphincter. So you remember the sphincter is that tight muscle at the base of the esophagus that regulates food going into the stomach. Well, when that sphincter is closed, it also keeps the contents of the stomach from moving back up into your esophagus. So in your stomach, we have that hydrochloric acid. The hydrochloric acid doesn't damage the lining of your stomach because your stomach has that thick mucus that protects it. But your esophagus doesn't have that thick mucus layer. So if your sphincter isn't closed tightly, some of the acidic stomach contents can actually move up into your esophagus and severely damage your esophagus because it doesn't have the protection of that mucus layer. GERD is an abbreviation for gastroesophageal reflux disease or chronic heartburn, and symptoms can include burning sensation, pain, some complications including bleeding, ulcers, and cancer in really, really high damage cases. Peptic ulcers. When we talked about the stomach, we talked about how it's normally protected from acid and pepsin by mucus. Ulcers occur in the stomach, esophagus, or small intestine from damage to the lining by stomach acid and pepsin. It can also be caused by a microorganism, a bacterium called Heliobacter pylori, aspirin, and other pain relievers. And symptoms and complications of peptic ulcers include pain and bleeding. And this is a picture of peptic ulcer. So this is probably the lining of the stomach here. And then this is just a little hole in the side that's been eaten away by the pepsin. The pepsin is really starting to digest a little crater here in the side of the stomach. And without the mucus to protect it, and with this little crater, you can actually develop a really bad infection because this little crater, these little edges here, as food moves through your stomach, bacteria can really set up shop, camp out, and start breeding and multiplying in the ridges of that ulcer. All right, now we're on gallstones. We talked about your gallbladder and how it's an important assisting organ in the digestive system. Sometimes solid material can accumulate in the gallbladder and or bile ducts, thereby blocking the movement of bile. You would know if this is happening because you would be experiencing pain on the right side of the abdominal cavity that generates to the back. Gallstones are usually treated by removing the whole gallbladder. But you remember, the gallbladder is responsible for the movement of bile from the liver into your gastrointestinal tract. So after the gallbladder is moved, the bile that's produced in the liver just drips directly into the intestine as it's produced rather than being stored and squeezed out by the gallbladder. And here's an x-ray showing the gallbladder and those little gallstones kind of packed within the gallbladder. Next, for complications, we have diarrhea. Diarrhea is characterized as frequent watery stools. It occurs when substances move too quickly through the large intestine for water to be absorbed, or when water is drawn down from cells into the lumen of the intestine. It can be caused by infections, irritants, medications, or diseases. Symptoms and complications of diarrhea include pain, dehydration, and malnutrition. So malnutrition, you might not necessarily associate with diarrhea, but in the instances of diarrhea, what you have is chyme moving too quickly through your small intestine, so quickly that the nutrients can't be properly absorbed into your body. So even though you might be eating all the vitamins and minerals that you need, because it's moving through so quickly, none of those minerals are actually being absorbed. The opposite of diarrhea, constipation, is characterized by hard, dry stools which are difficult to pass. It can be caused by too little water, fiber, or exercise, also decreased strength of large intestinal muscles, medications, or diseases. Delivering nutrients and eliminating wastes. The digestive system and cardiovascular system work really closely here. Water-soluble nutrients are absorbed into small blood vessels called capillaries, whereas lipid-soluble nutrients are absorbed into lymph vessels called lacteals. Now, your blood is an aqueous environment, right? It's made primarily of water. Now, if you've ever tried to mix oil and water, you notice that they don't mix. All right, so when we have lipid-soluble or fat-soluble nutrients, they aren't able to move through our blood because they can't mix in an aqueous environment, which is why lipid-soluble nutrients have to move through lymph vessels. Blood from the digestive system enters the portal circulation and first travels to the liver for detoxification and conversion and storage of some nutrients. The cardiovascular system, so this is where we're talking about the blood and the lymph. They return to the heart to be pumped to the body. Arteries carry blood away from the heart and branch into arterioles and capillaries. The capillaries drain into venules, which fuse to form veins, which return blood back to the heart to complete the cycle. There are two circuits in the cardiovascular system. The first is the pulmonary circuit. In the pulmonary circuit, the heart pumps blood to the lungs for removal of carbon dioxide and to pick up oxygen. In the systemic circuit, the heart pumps blood to the body and tissue cells to deliver that oxygen and pick up carbon dioxide. Then the blood moves into the pulmonary circuit and the whole cycle begins again. Gas exchange, which takes place at the end of the systemic circuit, occurs across the capillary walls. So the capillaries are the tiniest of your blood vessels, and oxygen and carbon dioxide can move freely across those. So the oxygen can be dropped off and the carbon dioxide can be picked up. And then this slide looks like, I think we already covered that slide. All right, so the lymphatic system works to absorb fat-soluble nutrients, removes fluids from tissues, and contains immune cells to help fight infection. This diagram is in your text. It just kind of shows you what we just talked about with the pulmonary and systemic systems of the circulatory system. The text is probably pretty small for you on your screen. I would encourage you to look over this diagram and make sure that you are familiar with both systems and how nutrients and gases are exchanged throughout the body. The elimination of wastes. Undigested food particles leave your body as feces. Carbon dioxide and some water leave your body via the lungs. Minerals and nitrogen-containing waste leave via the skin, and metabolic waste leaves your body via urine. This diagram, again, also in your text, gives you an idea of how each of those different wastes is excreted by the body. And a brief overview of metabolism. So this is a blown up picture of a cell. You'll remember from one of the very first slides of this lecture where the cell falls in as a unit of organization in our bodies. We have the larger cell. Then within the cell we have this organelle, which is called a mitochondria, and the mitochondria is where all the action takes place in a cell, right? We have citric acid cycle, We have the creation of ATP or energy, which if you remember is essential for active diffusion across the cell membrane. We're not going to go in depth into all of these cycles. We're just going to talk about them briefly as we finish up this chapter. So energy metabolism. One reason we eat foods is to obtain energy in the form of ATP. The energy yielding nutrients, carbohydrates, lipids, and protein, can be broken down to create ATP. This is what occurs during energy metabolism, also called cellular respiration. ATP is the energy the cell uses to do work. So that's what was going on in this photo. All of these systems that are happening inside the mitochondria of this animal cell right here. All this is doing is taking in fatty acids, amino acids, and glucose through a number of systems in order to create ATP so that that ATP can be used by cells to carry out their daily tasks. All right, so that's probably more information than you've ever wanted to know about the digestive system. Again, those diagrams I find them to be extremely helpful when trying to organize your thoughts about each of the organs and really understanding the purposes of each of the organs within the larger digestive system. Make sure to look those over, make sure you're familiar with the functions of each of the parts, and if you have any questions, feel free to shoot me an email. Thanks, guys.